Hello, everyone. This is Professor Sexton with the video lecture on Eric Fromm's essay, Disobedience as a Psychological and Moral Problem. Even though this essay is not particularly long, it is very rich in terms of details. So when you're reading the essay, you do want to make sure that you go slowly and that you underline things as you read and annotate it. So that way you'll have a sense of the ideals that Fromm is presenting. And as usual, you may want to watch this video lecture first before you actually read the essay, or whatever way. So in Disobedience as a Psychological and Moral Problem, Eric Fromm attempts to answer the question, why is man so prone to obey, and why is it so difficult for him to disobey? He begins by stating, for centuries, kings, priests, feudal lords, industrial bosses, and parents have insisted that obedience is a virtue, which means that it is good, and that disobedience is a vice, which means that it is bad. Simply restated, he means that we have been taught, conditioned to view obedience as good and disobedience as bad. Fromm, however, does not believe that all obedience is good and that all disobedience is bad. So pay attention to that emphasis on all. He explains that if we look closely at Hebrew and Greek myths, we will see that human history began with acts of disobedience. When Adam and Eve, what he calls the Hebrew myth, disobeyed, they were able to take the first step into independence and freedom. In leaving the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had to break the bonds with nature and rely on their own powers to become fully human. Fromm explains that to be fully human means that man develops his own power of reason and love. In the Greek myth, Prometheus' act of disobedience and stealing the fire from the gods lays the foundation for the evolution of man. Fromm argues that it's through continued acts of disobedience that man has continued to evolve. Fromm's essay must be read and situated within the historical time period in which it was published, 1963. The world had recently witnessed the horrors of World War II that ranged from 1939 to 1945, and how during the Nazi regime, men and women obeyed orders that resulted in the deaths of millions. Fromm writes of Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the major organizers of the mass deportation of Jews to the ghettos and extermination camps during the Holocaust. While on trial for his crimes in 1961, Eichmann simply responded that he was following orders. In his pardon plea, which was only released in 2016, Eichmann wrote, quote, there is a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders. I was not a responsible leader, and as much do not feel myself guilty. End quote. Fromm argues that Eichmann and many of us, although not on the level of Eichmann, have lost the capacity to disobey. During the Cold War, the period immediately following World War II, roughly ranged from 1946 to 1991, there was a fear that mankind would destroy itself because people will obey those who command them to push the daily buttons. So when Fromm writes this essay, he is concerned with the real threat that mankind and its reluctance to disobey might destroy itself. Fromm argues that historically, we are obedient to institutions such as the state, the church, and public opinion because our obedience makes us feel safe and protected. Furthermore, it makes us feel part of the power we worship, and hence we feel strong. To disobey, much like Adam and Eve and Prometheus, we have to give up that sense of being safe and part of the power or authority. To disobey, one must have the courage to be alone, to err, and to sin. He further explains throughout much of human history, it has been the few that have ruled over the many. Here we can think of royalty. Usually, a country has one queen or king, yet this one person rules over many. Fromm explains that in order for the minority, and here we are speaking in terms of numbers, not of who hold power, to keep it rules over the majority, the few in power need for the many without power to obey. While a monarch, a state, a religious leader, a boss, or so on could use force, The disadvantage is that one day those many under those institutions might gain enough force to overthrow the few in power. The better situation is for the minority, and this is the few in power, to convince the minority, the many without power, that it is in their best interest to obey so that they feel safe, protected, and part of the power. Laws, and what is often designated as a sin or crime, according to Fromm, are used to keep the many without power in line so that the few with power may enjoy their authority, power without threat of losing it. It is for these reasons that for centuries, kings, priests, feudal lords, industrial bosses, and parents have insisted that obedience is a virtue and that disobedience is a vice. To understand how these historical imperatives have affected our views of obedience and disobedience, Fromm makes distinctions between two types of obedience, two types of conscience, and two types of authority. And this is the part of his essay that you have to be really careful with to kind of tease out his definition and his distinction between these terms. So the first type of obedience that Fromm, what Fromm is heteronymous, which is obedience to a person, institution, or power, is submission because it implies the abdication, and abdication means just to give up, of my autonomy, and autonomy is independence, and the acceptance of a foreign will or judgment in place of my own. So, in other words, it is bad because people are allowing their convictions and judgments to be dictated by others. The second type is autonomous, which is obedience to my own reason or conviction, and is not an act of submission. So, in other words, this type is good because a person is following one's own convictions and judgments. The first type of conscience is authoritarian, which is the internalized voice of an authority whom we are eager to please and afraid of displeasing. Fromm explains it in terms of Sigmund Freud's ego, that internalized command and prohibition of father accepted by the son out of fear. The authoritarian conscience related to heteronymous obedience because we are following someone else's conventions and judgments. And keep in mind with the authoritarian conscience, it doesn't have to actually be an actual person standing over you telling you that you need to do this, but it's something that you have been taught to believe by a particular person. And even though that person might not physically be there, you still hear that person's voice in your head dictating your actions. The second type of conscience is what Fromm calls humanistic, which is the voice present in every human being and independent from external sanctions and rewards. And is related to autonomous obedience because we are acting independently without the fear or reward or punishment from a foreign will. So the autonomous conscious, we're following our own convictions and thoughts. To understand how the types of obedience and conscience works, we must also understand the different types of authority. Rational authority is when the interests of both the authority figure and the person she or he command lie in the same direction. So Fromm gives an example of a teacher, who will be the authority figure, and a student, the person the teacher commands. He explains that in the ideal situation, the interests of the teacher and the student lie in the same direction. The teacher wants the student to succeed, and the student wants to succeed. So they both have the same goal. So that's why that's rational authority. Irrational authority exists when the interests of the authority figure and the person he or she commands lie in opposite directions. Here, Fromm gives the example of a slave owner and a slave. The slave owner wants to exploit the slave and get as much free labor from the person without any consideration of that person's life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness, whereas the slave's primary interest is to live. So in this scenario, the interest of the slave owner is antagonistic or against that of the slave because they have opposite goals. Therefore, it is an example of irrational authority. So to be clear, Fromm does not believe that all obedience is bad, that all disobedience is good. Instead, He advocates that we use an understanding of the types of obedience, conscience, and authority to be certain that when we act, we are acting based on our own independence and freedom, that our convictions and judgments are rooted in what we know to be intrinsically conducive of life and not destructive of it. As I said before, even though Fromm's essay is not particularly long, it is very rich with details, terminology. I know that most of you are probably reading this as the PDF version available on Blackboard, but if you can, it would be helpful to print it out, to underline, to take notes, or even in the PDF, you should be able to annotate the PDF as well. And as I said before, if you're after reading the essay, if it's still unclear to you, you may want to watch this video lecture again. And if that is still unclear and you have particular specific questions about the essay, feel free to send me an email so I can clear up anything that might be confusing to you. Okay, I hope you enjoy reading the Fromm essay. Bye.